Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped out of the diplomatic vehicle at Buckingham Palace, her confidence radiating as cameras flashed around her. The 34-year-old politician had arrived in London for the International Climate Leadership Summit, representing the United States alongside other progressive leaders from around the world. This was her first major international diplomatic assignment. She was determined to make a strong impression. The morning air was crisp as AOC adjusted her professional blazer and checked her phone one final time before the official ceremonies began. Her social media team had planned extensive coverage of the visit, knowing that her millions of followers would be eager to see her representing American values on the global stage. Standing at attention near the palace entrance was Master Sergeant Jonathan Clark, a decorated veteran with 20 years of military service. Jonathan had earned his position through exceptional dedication and had protected world leaders, diplomats, and royalty throughout his distinguished career. His red ceremonial uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his expression professionally. Nella noticed the guard immediately as her delegation approached the palace steps. She had read about the famous British guards during her flight preparation, learning about their tradition of remaining silent and motionless, regardless of what happened around them. The concept fascinated her from a political perspective. The idea of maintaining composure under pressure was something she understood well from her own career. The diplomatic protocol officer, Margaret Richardson, began explaining the schedule to AOC and the other delegates. They would participate in a brief photo opportunity, meet with palace officials, and then proceed to their climate summit meetings. The entire palace visit was expected to take approximately 30 minutes. The guards you see are active military personnel, Margaret explained as they walked toward the entrance. They maintain their positions regardless of distractions and are trained to respond only to genuine security threats or official commands from their superiors. AOC nodded, but her attention was already shifting to how she might use this experience to connect with her audience back home. She had built her political brand on accessibility and authenticity, often using humor and relatable commentary to make complex political situations understandable to ordinary Americans. As the delegation paused for their first round of photos, AOC found herself standing just a few feet from Jonathan's position. She could see his disciplined posture and unwavering focus, traits that reminded her of the dedication required in political service. However, her competitive nature began to view his silence as a challenge rather than recognizing it as professional protocol. The other international delegates were taking their photos efficiently and moving through the ceremony with appropriate diplomatic decorum. French Environment Minister Claire Dubois maintained respectful distance from the guards while discussing policy points with her colleagues. German Representative Klaus Müller focused entirely on the substantive discussions they would be having later about renewable energy initiatives. AOC, however, found herself increasingly curious about testing the limits of the guards' famous composure. Her social media instincts kicked in as she realized this could be an opportunity to create engaging content that would demonstrate her fearless approach to traditional power structures. These guys are supposed to be impossible to distract, she whispered to her chief of staff, Maria Santos, who was documenting the visit for official purposes. I wonder how they maintain that kind of discipline. Maria felt a slight unease at her boss's tone, recognizing the signs that AOC was about to do something unpredictable. Throughout their working relationship, Maria had learned that the Congresswoman's spontaneous moments could sometimes create diplomatic complications, especially in formal international settings. Jonathan remained focused on his duties, aware of the diplomatic activity around him, but maintaining the professional detachment that his position required. He had guarded countless political figures and understood that some officials like to test the boundaries of ceremonial protocol. His training had prepared him for various types of interactions. From genuine curiosity to deliberate provocation, the official photographer began arranging the delegates for their group photo, positioning them in front of the palace's iconic facade. AOC took her designated place, but continued glancing toward Jonathan's position, her mind working through possibilities for engaging with the situation in a way that would resonate with her. Political base. Margaret noticed AOC's distracted attention and gently tried to redirect her focus to the ceremonial proceedings. Congresswoman, if you're ready, we'll move on to the meeting with the palace officials, who will brief you on the afternoon's climate discussions. But AOC's political instincts were telling her that this moment represented an opportunity to demonstrate something important about challenging traditional authority structures. She had built her career on questioning established norms and speaking directly to power, regardless of the formal protocols that others might find intimidating. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test both AOC's political judgment and Jonathan's professional training in ways that neither of them had anticipated. When their duties brought them to the same place on this significant morning, as the official photography session concluded, AOC made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of her diplomatic visit. Instead of following the other delegates toward their scheduled meetings, she approached Jonathan's position with the confidence that had made her famous in American politics. "This is fascinating," AOC announced, loud enough for the nearby cameras and delegates to hear. "Here we have someone whose entire job is to stand perfectly still and never speak. It's like a living statue performance, but with military precision." Jonathan maintained his professional composure, having encountered countless attempts by various dignitaries to engage him inappropriately over the years. His training had taught him to distinguish between casual observations and deliberate provocations, and he recognized that this situation required careful handling. AOC's social media team, led by Communications Director Jake Rodriguez, immediately began recording the interaction. They sensed that their boss was creating one of those spontaneous moments that often went viral and reinforced her reputation as someone who wasn't intimidated by traditional power structures. Think about it. AOC continued, positioning herself so that both she and Jonathan were clearly visible to the cameras. "In America, we believe in free speech, in engaging with our leaders, in asking questions. But here, the whole system is built on this idea that some people just don't get to participate in the conversation." Margaret Richardson felt her diplomatic training alarm bells ringing as she watched AOC turn what should have been a brief ceremonial moment into an impromptu political commentary. She approached carefully, trying to redirect the situation without creating an international incident. "Congresswoman, perhaps we should proceed to your scheduled briefing," Margaret suggested diplomatically. "The climate summit organizers are waiting to discuss the afternoon's renewable energy presentations." But AOC was in her element now, sensing an audience and an opportunity to make a point that would resonate with her political base back home. She had built her career on challenging established norms, and this seemed like the perfect moment to demonstrate that approach on an international stage. "No, this is actually really interesting from a governance perspective," AOC replied, her voice carrying the confidence that had made her a prominent figure in progressive politics. "Here's someone who's literally paid to have no opinions, no voice, no individual expression. It's like the ultimate symbol of how traditional power structures try to silence people." Jonathan's military training included extensive preparation for handling situations where political figures attempted to use guards as props for their own messaging. He understood that AOC was not necessarily trying to insult him personally, but rather using his presence to make a broader political point. However, her commentary was beginning to cross lines that he couldn't ignore indefinitely. The other international delegates were watching the interaction with growing concern. Claire Dubois exchanged worried glances with Klaus Mueller, both recognizing that their American colleague was creating a situation that could complicate the entire summit's diplomatic objectives. AOC's chief of staff, Maria Santos, tried to intervene subtly by approaching her boss and whispering, "Maybe we should focus on the climate discussions. The press is here for the environmental policy announcements." But AOC was committed to her impromptu demonstration now. She had recognized an opportunity to illustrate what she saw as the contrast between American democratic values and European traditional hierarchy. Her political instincts told her that this moment could become a powerful symbol of her willingness to challenge authority, regardless of the setting. "I'm curious," AOC said, addressing Jonathan directly now. "Do you ever get tired of pretending that you don't have thoughts or opinions about what's happening around you? Like right now, you're watching international leaders discuss climate policy that could affect your children's future, but you're not allowed to participate in that conversation. Jonathan felt the situation shifting into territory that would require him to make a professional response. AOC's commentary had moved from general political observations to direct personal questions that challenged his military protocol. His years of experience had taught him exactly how to handle this type of provocation. But the solution would not be what AOC was expecting. The cameras continued rolling as AOC waited for some kind of reaction, confident that she was demonstrating her fearless approach to questioning authority. Her political experience had taught her that traditional power structures often crumbled when confronted directly, and she expected this situation to follow a similar pattern. Margaret Richardson made one final attempt at diplomatic intervention. "Congresswoman, I really must insist that we proceed to your briefing. The other delegates are waiting, and we have a very tight schedule to maintain." AOC waved off the diplomatic protocol officer, fully committed to her confrontation now. "This will just take a moment. I think it's important that we address these power dynamics directly instead of just pretending they don't exist." Jonathan prepared himself for what he knew would be a moment that neither AOC nor the watching delegates would ever forget. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and he was ready to demonstrate why the British military's ceremonial traditions had earned respect throughout the world. AOC stepped closer to Jonathan's position, her confidence building as she sensed what she believed was a captive audience for her political demonstration. The cameras were rolling, her social media team was documenting everything, and she felt she was about to create a moment that would perfectly illustrate her approach to challenging traditional authority. "You know what I think is really interesting here?" AOC continued, her voice carrying the prosecutorial tone she often used during congressional hearings. "We're supposed to be impressed by someone who's trained to have no individual expression, no personal agency, no voice in the democratic process. But isn't that exactly the kind of mindless obedience that we should be questioning?" Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that AOC's words were having any impact. His 20 years of military service had included combat deployments where his disciplined training had saved lives, peacekeeping missions where his professionalism had prevented international incidents, and countless ceremonial duties where his composure had upheld British dignity on the world stage. Other delegates were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of AOC's commentary. German Representative Klaus Müller whispered to his aide, "This is becoming quite inappropriate. Should someone intervene?" French Environment Minister Claire Dubois felt embarrassed for her American colleague, recognizing that AOC was creating a diplomatic situation that could affect all of their climate policy discussions. She had worked with many American politicians and knew that most understood the importance of respecting local customs during international visits. AOC's communications director, Jake Rodriguez, continued recording, but was beginning to feel uncertain about whether this content would serve their political objectives. He had seen his boss challenge authority effectively many times before, but something about this situation felt different from her usual confrontations with corporate executives or fellow politicians. "I mean, let's be honest about what we're looking at here," AOC continued, gesturing toward Jonathan as if he were an exhibit in a political science lesson. "This is someone who's been conditioned to suppress every natural human instinct toward individual expression and democratic participation. It's actually kind of sad when you think about it." Margaret Richardson made a final diplomatic attempt to salvage the situation. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, I really must inform you that the palace officials are waiting for our arrival. The climate summit schedule cannot accommodate further delays." But AOC was fully committed to her demonstration now. She had built her political reputation on moments exactly like this, unscripted confrontations with traditional power structures that revealed what she saw as the truth behind formal protocols and established hierarchies. "No, I think this is actually really important," AOC replied, her voice taking on the passionate intensity that her supporters loved and her critics feared. "How can we have meaningful discussions about democracy and representation when we're surrounded by people who are literally trained to have no voice, no opinions, no individual agency?" Jonathan's training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. He had encountered political figures who tried to use royal guards as props for their own messaging, activists who attempted to provoke reactions for publicity purposes, and diplomats who misunderstood the serious nature of ceremonial military duties. AOC moved even closer to Jonathan's position, confident that she was demonstrating her fearless approach to questioning authority. "I'm genuinely curious. Do you have opinions about climate policy? About the democratic process? About whether ordinary people should have a voice in the decisions that affect their lives?" The question hung in the air as cameras continued. Recording, and the assembled delegates waited to see how the situation would resolve. AOC expected her challenge to either produce an embarrassed silence that would prove her point about mindless obedience, or perhaps cause the guard to break protocol in a way that would validate her. Criticism of traditional authority structures. Jonathan's military experience had taught him that some challenges required direct responses rather than passive endurance. AOC's commentary had moved beyond casual provocation into territory that questioned the fundamental principles of military service, democratic values, and personal dignity. Maria Santos, AOC's chief of staff, felt a growing sense that her boss had misjudged this situation. Unlike congressional hearings or political debates where AOC's aggressive style often proved effective, this confrontation was taking place in a context with different rules and different stakes. The international delegates. AOC waited for Jonathan's response, confident that she had created a moment that would demonstrate her willingness to challenge authority, regardless of the setting. She had no idea that her assumptions about military protocol and British ceremonial traditions were about to be thoroughly corrected. Jonathan prepared to deliver a response that would not only address AOC's direct questions, but would also demonstrate why the tradition she was mocking had earned respect from world leaders for generations. His 20 years of military service had given him both the authority and the knowledge to educate the Congresswoman about subjects she clearly didn't understand. The moment that would define the entire diplomatic visit was about to unfold. It would be nothing like what AOC had expected when she decided to challenge what she perceived as mindless traditional authority. 50 seconds had passed since AOC began her confrontational commentary when Jonathan made a decision that would completely transform the situation. His military training had taught him exactly when passive endurance needed to give way to direct engagement, and that moment had arrived. "Ma'am," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of military service. "With respect, your understanding of my role and my capabilities appears to be fundamentally incorrect." The words hit the scene like a thunderclap. AOC's confident expression faltered as she realized that her assumptions about the guard's inability to respond had been completely wrong. The cameras continued rolling, but now they were capturing her reaction to an entirely unexpected development. Jonathan's voice remained respectful but commanding as he continued. "I am Master Sergeant Jonathan Clark, and I have served in 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan, 2 peacekeeping missions in the Balkans, and have protected heads of state from 17 different nations during my ceremonial duties." The assembled delegates watched in fascination as the entire dynamic of the confrontation reversed. AOC, who had built her reputation on being quick with responses and never being caught off guard, found herself speechless as Jonathan dismantled her assumptions with calm professionalism. "You suggested that I have no opinions about climate policy?" Jonathan continued, his military bearing making every word carry weight. "I hold a master's degree in environmental science from Cambridge University, which I completed during my off-duty hours because I believe deeply in understanding the challenges facing our planet." AOC's social media team stopped recording, realizing that this footage would not serve their intended narrative. Jake Rodriguez felt his stomach sink as he understood that his boss had walked into a situation that was about to become a public relations disaster. "You questioned whether I understand democratic values," Jonathan said, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "I have risked my life in combat zones specifically to protect democratic institutions and the rights of civilian populations to participate in free elections." Margaret Richardson watched with professional fascination as Jonathan delivered what amounted to a masterclass in handling inappropriate diplomatic behavior. His response was simultaneously educational, dignified, and completely devastating to AOC's attempted demonstration. My silence during ceremonial duties is not mindless. Obedience, ma'am, Jonathan explained. It is a disciplined professional practice that ensures the safety of the dignitaries I protect while maintaining the dignity of the institutions I represent. It requires the same type of mental strength and strategic thinking that I use during combat operations. The other international delegates began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Claire Dubois recognized that. Jonathan's response was providing a glimpse into the serious training and expertise that lay behind ceremonial traditions that many people took for granted. AOC tried to recover her composure, but Jonathan's calm professionalism had completely undermined the foundation of her confrontation. I didn't mean to suggest that your service wasn't valuable, she stammered, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. Additionally, Jonathan continued, you asked whether I have thoughts about ordinary people having a voice in democratic decisions. I grew up in a working-class family in Manchester, served alongside soldiers from every social and economic background, and have dedicated my entire adult life to protecting the democratic systems that ensure everyone's voice can be heard. Maria Santos felt mortified as she watched her boss's political demonstration collapse completely. AOC had built her career on challenging authority figures who couldn't effectively respond to her provocations. But she had encountered someone with both the knowledge and the authority to educate her about subjects she had misunderstood: Jonathan's military training allowed him to deliver his correction without being disrespectful or creating a diplomatic incident. My role requires me to remain neutral during my duties because my personal opinions must never influence my professional responsibility to protect all political leaders equally, regardless of their views or their party affiliation. The assembled crowd was completely silent as Jonathan demonstrated the difference between someone who had actually dedicated their life to democratic service and someone who had built a career on performative challenges to authority. I have protected politicians from across the political spectrum, Jonathan concluded, including several American congresspeople who understood that respecting ceremonial protocols demonstrates respect for the democratic institutions we all serve. AOC realized that her attempt to demonstrate fearless leadership had instead revealed her own ignorance about military service, democratic values, and international diplomatic protocols. The moment that was supposed to showcase her political strength had become a humbling lesson in the importance of understanding situations before attempting to challenge them. The cameras that had been recording her confident confrontation had instead captured her being respectfully but thoroughly corrected by someone whose actual service to democratic values far exceeded her own. Political rhetoric, Klaus Mueller whispered to his aide, that was perhaps the most professionally handled diplomatic correction I have ever witnessed. Jonathan returned to his ceremonial stance, having delivered his educational response with the same precision and professionalism that characterized all aspects of his military service. AOC was left to contemplate how badly she had misjudged both the situation and the person she had chosen to challenge. The silence that followed Jonathan's response seemed to stretch endlessly. AOC stood frozen in place, her usual quick wit completely abandoned as she processed the magnitude of her miscalculation. The confident politician who had approached the guard expecting to demonstrate her fearless challenge to authority now faced the reality that she had embarrassed herself on an international stage. Margaret Richardson moved swiftly to salvage what remained of the diplomatic schedule. Perhaps we should proceed to the climate briefing now, she suggested gently. Trying to provide AOC with a graceful exit from the situation she had created, the other international delegates began moving toward the palace entrance. Their conversations muted, but their glances toward AOC, speaking volumes about how her confrontation had affected their perception of her diplomatic judgment. Claire Dubois and Klaus Mueller exchanged concerned looks, wondering how this incident might impact their collaborative climate policy discussions. AOC's chief of staff, Maria Santos, approached her boss with the careful demeanor of someone trying to manage a crisis. Congresswoman, we should really join the other delegates for the briefing, she whispered urgently. But AOC remained rooted in place, staring at Jonathan, who had returned to his ceremonial stance, as if the entire confrontation had never occurred. His professional composure was now revealed not as mindless obedience, but as the disciplined focus of someone with far more experience and expertise than she had assumed. Jake Rodriguez, her communications director, struggled with the reality that the footage they had captured would be impossible to use for their intended purposes. Instead of showing AOC fearlessly challenging traditional authority, the videos documented her being educated by someone whose actual service to democratic values far exceeded her own political rhetoric. "Ma'am," AOC finally said to Jonathan, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you and your service that were completely unfair and uninformed." Jonathan's response was as professional as his previous intervention had been. "No apology necessary, ma'am." These interactions sometimes provide opportunities for mutual understanding. But AOC knew that the situation was far more serious than Jonathan's gracious response suggested. She had not only embarrassed herself personally, but had potentially damaged America's reputation during an important international climate summit. Her attempt to demonstrate political courage had instead revealed a troubling lack of diplomatic wisdom as the group finally moved toward the palace entrance. Walk found herself walking beside Margaret Richardson, who had decades of experience managing diplomatic crises. "I really messed that up, didn't I?" Oak asked quietly. Margaret's response was diplomatically careful but honest. International relations require understanding the context and respecting the institutions of our host countries, even when they differ from our own traditions. Inside the palace, as they proceeded to their climate briefing, AOC struggled too. Focus on the environmental policy discussions that had originally brought her to London. Her mind kept returning to Jonathan's calm demolition of her assumptions and the realization that her political instincts had failed her completely in this context. The climate summit officials presented detailed proposals for renewable energy initiatives, carbon reduction strategies, and international cooperation frameworks. But AOC found herself thinking about the lesson. She had just learned about the difference between performative challenge to authority and actual understanding of complex institutions. During a break in the climate discussions, German Representative Klaus Müller approached AOC privately. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but that guard's response was quite educational for all of us. It's a good reminder that we should understand institutions before we critique them." AOC appreciated Klaus's diplomatic way of addressing the situation, but she knew that her behavior had been witnessed by delegates from multiple countries who would now question her judgment in future international negotiations. The incident would likely be reported in diplomatic circles and could affect her credibility during subsequent climate policy discussions. French environment. Minister Claire Dubois also spoke with AOC during the break, offering a perspective that was both supportive and corrective. In European diplomatic contexts, respecting local traditions while pursuing our policy objectives often produces better results than direct confrontation. As the climate summit continued, AOC gradually refocused on the environmental issues that had brought her to London. She contributed valuable insights about American renewable energy policies and demonstrated the knowledge and passion that had made her an effective climate advocate in Congress. However, the morning's incident with Jonathan had fundamentally changed her understanding of her role in international diplomacy. She began to realize that the aggressive, confrontational style that had served her well in American politics might not be appropriate or effective in every context. During the lunch break, AOC asked Margaret Richardson about Jonathan's background. Learning about his combat service, his education, and his years of diplomatic protection duty made her realize how completely she had misjudged both his capabilities and his character. "He's actually quite remarkable," Margaret explained. "Master Sergeant Clark has protected world leaders during some very tense international situations. His ability to maintain composure while staying aware of complex security concerns has prevented several potential diplomatic incidents." AOC felt a deepening sense of shame as she understood that her attempt to challenge what she perceived as mindless authority had actually targeted someone whose service to democratic values was far more substantial than her own political career. The lesson was humbling in ways that would affect her approach to leadership for years to come. 3 months after the Buckingham Palace incident, AOC sat in her Washington, D.C. office, reviewing draft legislation for veteran support services. The experience with Master Sergeant Jonathan Clark had profoundly changed her understanding of military service and the complexity of institutions she had previously viewed as simply traditional obstacles to progressive change. That the immediate aftermath of the London Climate Summit had been professionally challenging. News of her confrontation with the Royal Guard had leaked to diplomatic circles, and several international colleagues had privately expressed concerns about her judgment during formal diplomatic events. AOC had been forced to confront the reality that her political instincts required refinement for international contexts. Her chief of staff, Maria Santos, had worked diligently to limit the damage from the incident. The social media content that was supposed to showcase AOC's fearless leadership was quietly shelved, placed with educational posts about the climate policy agreements that had been successfully negotiated during the summit. But for AOC personally, the most significant impact was the realization that her approach to challenging authority needed to become more sophisticated and informed. Jonathan's calm response had revealed gaps in her understanding that went beyond just military protocols. It had exposed a broader tendency to make assumptions about people and institutions without fully investigating their actual purposes. In value, she had spent weeks researching military service, ceremonial duties, and the backgrounds of the guards who protected diplomatic functions around the world. What she discovered was a community of highly educated, deeply committed professionals whose service extended far beyond the ceremonial roles that tourists typically observed. AOC reached out to veteran organizations in her district asking to meet with former service members who could help her understand military culture and the perspectives of people who had dedicated their careers to protecting democratic institutions. These conversations proved to be among the most educational experiences of her political career. One particularly impactful meeting was with former Army Sergeant Patricia Williams, constituent who had served 3 combat deployments before transitioning to civilian life. Patricia helped AOC understand how military discipline and service connected to broader democratic values rather than opposing them. When I was overseas, Patricia explained, our job was literally to protect people's right to vote, to speak freely, to participate in democracy. The discipline and protocol you saw in London isn't about suppressing individual expression. It's about ensuring that democratic institutions can function safely. These conversations led AOC to sponsor new legislation supporting veteran education benefits and transition services. She approached the work with the same passion she brought to climate policy, but with a newfound respect for the complexity of military service and the people who chose that path. The legislation she developed included provisions for educational support specifically designed for veterans pursuing advanced degrees in fields like environmental science. Recognizing that many service members combine their military careers with expertise in civilian fields, just as Jonathan had done with his Cambridge environmental science degree, when the Veteran Support Bill came up for committee hearings, invited Master Sergeant Clark to provide testimony about the educational needs of active-duty military personnel who wanted to develop expertise in civilian fields while maintaining their service commitments. Jonathan accepted the invitation, traveling to Washington to participate in congressional hearings for the first time. His testimony was as composed and informative as his response had been at Buckingham Palace, providing lawmakers with insights into how military service could be enhanced through educational opportunities. Military personnel bring unique perspectives to civilian fields like environmental science, international relations, and public policy, Jonathan testified. Our service gives us direct experience with the practical consequences of policy decisions, which can inform more effective solutions to complex challenges. During a break in the hearings, AOC approached Jonathan privately to offer a more personal apology for her behavior in London. I want you to know that meeting you changed how I think about leadership and service. I'm grateful for the lesson you taught me, even though it was embarrassing at the time. Jonathan's response reflected the same professionalism he had shown during their original encounter. Leadership requires continuous learning, ma'am. Your work on veteran education issues suggests that you took the right lessons from our interaction. The veteran support legislation passed with bipartisan support. It's becoming one of AOC's most successful collaborative efforts with Republican colleagues, who were impressed by her newfound understanding of military perspectives and her commitment. 2. Supporting service members' educational goals. AOC's approach to international diplomacy also evolved significantly following the London incident. She sought mentoring from experienced diplomatic officials, studied the cultural contexts of countries she visited, and developed a more nuanced understanding of when confrontational tactics were appropriate, when they might be counterproductive. Her next International Climate Summit, held in Copenhagen 6 months later, demonstrated her growth as a diplomatic leader. She successfully advocated for aggressive climate policies while showing appropriate respect for local customs and building. Collaborative relationships with international colleagues. The incident with Jonathan had taught AOC that true leadership required understanding the difference between challenging unjust systems and respecting valuable institutions. Her political effectiveness actually increased as she learned to distinguish between obstacles that needed to be confronted and traditions that deserved respect. Years later, when young political activists asked AOC about her approach to challenging authority, she would tell them about the royal guard who taught her that the most powerful challenges to unjust systems come from people who thoroughly understand what they're critiquing and who combine passion with wisdom. The lesson she learned from Master Sergeant Jonathan Clark, that assumptions about people's capabilities and motivations can be dangerously wrong, became a foundation of her mature political philosophy and one of the most valuable educational experiences of her career in public service.